suffering and our finite, that is, limited knowledge. Suffering and our finite knowledge. At last, I've arrived. Whether you're a student with high aspirations or a pensioner simply going on holiday, we all want to be able to say the words, I've arrived. I've arrived. My lifelong goal has been achieved. I've arrived. At last, I've reached my destination. We all want to be able to say the words, I've arrived. However, a lot has to happen before a person is able to say them. A student might have to endure 5 long and boring math lectures each week and stay up late doing homework. But when that student becomes a university professor, they'll be able to say the words, I've arrived. In the same way, no traveller enjoys the hours at the airport or the turbulent journey on the ferry. But when that traveller arrives at the northern lights of Iceland, at last they'll be able to say the words, I've arrived. We all want to be able to say those words, I've arrived. However, a lot has to happen before a person is able to say them. Now, in our study of the biblical book of Job, we'll be looking at the problem of suffering. And by the end of the series, I guess we'll all be hoping we'll be able to say the words, I've arrived. I've arrived. I now understand the problem of suffering. I've arrived. My questions have been answered. And suddenly everything makes sense. But before we set off with that goal in mind, I'd like you to consider how you'd react in the following situation. You send your child or grandchild upstairs with the task of understanding Einstein's theory of relativity. But after 5 minutes, they come down and say, I've arrived. I've arrived. I now understand the theory of everything. I've done all the sums, and now everything makes sense. Do you believe them? No, no one can understand in 5 minutes what took Einstein 10 years. Or how about you sit down on the seat on the journey to visit Iceland's northern lights, but after 5 minutes the driver of your vehicle announces, We've arrived. Do you really think you've arrived? No. You may have arrived at the frozen supermarket Iceland, but you're miles away from Iceland's northern lights. In the first few chapters of Job, we're introduced to the problem of suffering. Job, an innocent man, has his business, his family, and his health all immediately taken away. Job is in a place of suffering that is so great that in chapter 3 he wishes that he'd not been born. He's not only in physical agony, he's in mental and spiritual agony. For to him, the problem of suffering just doesn't make sense. After 5 minutes of reading chapters 1, 2, and 3, the problem of suffering is introduced. And upon reaching chapter 4, one of Job's 3 friends declares, I've arrived. I've arrived. Job, I understand the reason for your suffering. Let me answer your questions, and suddenly everything will make sense. Chapters 4 to 37 of the book of Job are basically 33 long chapters of one recurring idea. Job's 3 friends believe they fully answered Job's problem of suffering, the short version of their conclusion being this: Job, you are suffering because you've sinned. If you've read chapters 1 and 2, you'll immediately know that this answer is wrong. Job is described by the author of the book as being innocent. And if you read the last chapter of the book of Job, you'll realize that God agrees. God appears on the scene and declares that Job is innocent in every way. So here we have the book of Job in a nutshell. 33 long chapters in which 4 people attempt to answer the problem of Job's suffering. These are 33 quite long chapters which go on for quite a while. And yet, at the end of the book, God does this. He does that to everything that Job's 3 friends have said. In other words, they got it wrong. There is no short, no simple answer to the problem of suffering. Yes, finite humans, that is, with limited knowledge. Yes, finite humans like me and you may try and understand it, explain it, give reasons why God allows it. But despite all of our best efforts, none of us can ever claim to have arrived. Instead, we need to humbly accept that we don't know all the answers, and this is always the best way to begin. The best place for a math student to begin is by admitting their lack of knowledge to their university professor, but at least they're willing to trust his guidance. The best place for any traveller to begin is by admitting that they don't know the best way to Iceland, but they're willing to trust the pilot. So what is the best way for us to begin our study in the problem of suffering? The best way to begin is not by accusing God of being wrong for allowing it. The best way to begin is not by expecting God to answer all our questions before we'll trust Him. The best way to begin is not by claiming we understand how God works all things for good. The best way to begin is not by saying to other people, I've arrived, let me give you a few sentences of theology, and all your questions will evaporate in no time at all. No. The best way for us to begin our study in the problem of suffering is not by saying I've arrived. The best way for us to begin is by trusting that God is good, powerful, and infinitely more wise than me and you. We need to accept that God is infinitely more wise than any of us, and then accept whatever answers God does and doesn't give. So what does the book of Job reveal to us about the problem of suffering? Well, suffering sucks. The truth that the book of Job declares is that suffering sucks. Even the atheist will agree with the Bible on this point. And though I'm sure no one listening needs reminding of this fact, it's good to know that God agrees. Much of the book of Job consists of Job being open and honest with God about the depth of his suffering, even bordering on the sense of suicide at some points. And though we might sit in our comfortable armchairs and criticize Job for being so aggressive and complaining towards God and despairing to such degrees, though we might sit in our comfortable armchairs and criticize Job, at the end of the book of Job, God declares that Job spoke nothing wrong. Suffering sucks, and God agrees. Suffering sucks, and since Genesis comes before Job in the order of the books of the Bible, we, the reader, are meant to already know that suffering was not a part of God's good original creation. We're meant to know that suffering entered the world because of human sin. It's with this background knowledge that we're meant to read Job chapters 1 and 2, in which we read the following words. Job chapter 1 verse 6. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, Where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? There was no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Job's suffering involved death, injured health, and several natural disasters. These normal, familiar, natural, so to speak, forms of suffering are part of us living in a world that has been broken because of human sin. However, we learn that in Job's case it was Satan who specifically asked to send such suffering in Job's direction. And we learn again that Satan had to ask for God's permission. Whilst it would be wrong to assume that the same chain of events happens in every incident of suffering, what we learn from chapters 1 and 2 is this: God still remains in control, in ultimate control over this world that has been infected with suffering. Not even suffering happens without his permission. Satan is limited physically. God describes Satan as only being able to be in one place at one time. And Satan is limited spiritually. It is God who possesses all power and authority, no one else. And even Satan had to ask, in this case, for God's permission to let Job's suffering take place. Now, that doesn't mean Satan is directly involved in every aspect of suffering in quite the same way. But it does teach us something valuable. God is in ultimate control over this world, despite it being infected by sin. Now I realize that this might be very confusing or hard to accept and distressing. If God has ultimate control over everything in the world, including suffering, why does God even allow it? The fact that God remains fully in control in a world full of suffering can cause people not to want to believe in God, as well as causing those who do believe in God to be confused and distressed. But before you turn off this video, please first ask if you'd really want it any other way. Would you really want Satan to have full power over suffering? Would you really want to live in a world in which God was powerless over the forces of evil and death? Would you really want to live in a world ruled by blind fate or the God of bad luck and chance? To help us consider these three alternatives, put yourself in the following analogy. You're a teenager again, and you put a CD into your CD player and press play. The only problem is the CD you put in is the type of music you most hate. You cannot press the stop button, and so you're destined to spend eternity listening to rap music, country western, or whatever style of music that you most hate. In this bad situation, which of the three following options would you choose? Option number 1. Would you choose to have the CD player stuck to the ceiling? No one, not even your loving father, can reach the CD player there. Your father can't even turn down the volume or reach the stop button with a broom. For these reasons, you're destined to spend eternity listening to the most hated music ever. And all you can say is, whatever will be, will be. I really hope that the next song isn't Slipknot style heavy metal. A world in which neither you nor your father have control over the disastrous mistake that you made is a very bad world to live in, indeed. That's option number 1. Or option number 2. Option number 2. Would you choose to hand over your CD player to Ozzy Osbourne, presuming that you hate Ozzy Osbourne style heavy metal? Hand the CD player over to Ozzy? No, thank you. Let him have his hands on the CD player, and he's bound to torture you by turning up the volume to full blast. A world in which the volume of your suffering is determined by someone who loves heavy metal is a very bad world to live in. Satan, in a world in which the volume of your suffering is ultimately controlled by Satan, who loves evil and hates you. A world in which the volume of your suffering is ultimately controlled by Satan, well, that's even worse. So the third option. Would you choose to hand over your CD player to someone who is good, powerful, and wise? Someone who allowed the music to play in the background for a while, but also had the power to turn the music fully off. Now God is powerful. God is not like the father who cannot even reach the CD player stuck on the ceiling, wanting to stop the dreadful noise, but being powerless to do anything about it. God's not like that. God is powerful and God is good. If God simply abandoned us to our mistakes, God could abandon the world to endure suffering at full volume, and his decision could still be described as just and fair. It was humans who chose to sin and so allow suffering into the world, and that could have so easily been the end of the story. But the good news is that God is both supremely powerful and amazingly good. Powerful in the sense that he can turn the volume of our suffering up and ultimately turn it off. God is powerful enough to press the stop button and one day end all suffering for good. Despite Job's limited knowledge of why God allowed him to suffer, Job clung to these two facts. Job clung to the fact that God, not Satan or blind fate, was in control of his suffering. Job clung to the hope that God would one day bring all his suffering to an end. Now, don't get me wrong, Job still found the problem of suffering distressing and confusing and hard. Job experienced pain firsthand. To him, the problem of suffering certainly wasn't an academic question. Job believed in a good God, and yet his suffering made him question if this was true. Job still found the problem of suffering hard, distressing, confusing. And yet, we read in chapter 42 that he arrived. Job arrived. Chapter 42, verse 1. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Here Job acknowledges that God is all-powerful. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I have spoken of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Job acknowledges that God is all-wise. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, says Job, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job arrives by acknowledging the following three things. Job acknowledges that God is all-powerful. Job acknowledges that God is all-wise. And Job acknowledges that the best thing for him to do is to humbly trust God. Job acknowledges that God is all-powerful. Job acknowledges that God is all-wise. And Job arrives at a place of humble trust and dependence on God. And it's at this point that Job could confidently say, I've arrived. Had Job arrived in the sense that he fully understood why God allowed his suffering? No, God never explained to Job why. Had Job arrived in the sense that he confidently knew when his suffering would end? No, Job learnt to trust God in the midst of his suffering, without any sign of when his suffering was going to end. Job never arrived in the sense that all his why and when questions were fully answered. He had asked many questions, many times. How could God allow his suffering? Where were you, God, when his suffering was going on? Job asked many why, when, where, and how type questions, to which Job never received an answer. But in chapters 38 to 41, some amazing chapters, I strongly advise you read them. But in chapters 38 to 41, God gives Job the answer to the question of who. In chapter 38, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. And in chapters 38 to 40, God declares to Job his infinite wisdom as displayed in creation. God's infinite wisdom in organizing the earth and universe and keeping them in perfect balance. God's infinite wisdom in creating creatures that are so wonderfully designed and perfectly adapted to their environment. God displays his infinite wisdom that is far, 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 far greater than the finite and limited wisdom of man. In chapters 38 to 39, God declares to Job his infinite power and his infinite wisdom, his power in creating a world full of orbiting stars and planets that don't collide, God's infinite power that is greater than the power of every creature he has ever created. God has infinite power that can start things and stop things. God's great power that is even greater, great enough to bring all suffering to the end. And when Job fully understands that an infinitely wise and an infinitely powerful God is the who of who is in control of his suffering, when Job learns this and understands this, Job learns to fully trust God. Chapter 41, verses 1 to 5. The Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him accuse God. Let him who accuses God answer him." Then Job answered the Lord, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." I'd never trust myself to take myself to the country of Iceland. I cannot even find the sausages in the frozen supermarket Iceland. Never mind find my way to Iceland, which contains the Northern Lights. I'll never trust myself to take myself to the country of Iceland, but I would trust a wise pilot who is powerful enough to fly a very powerful plane. Though neither me or you will ever arrive in the sense of fully understanding why God allows suffering to continue, that is, continue in this life. Though neither me or you will arrive in the sense of fully understanding suffering, the book of Job is there to teach us that we can trust God. God is all powerful. God can and will end all suffering. God is all wise. God wisely turns up and down the volume control of suffering for reasons only known to him. God is all good. For those who put their faith in Jesus, God promises that one day all their suffering will come to an end. More on the hope that Jesus gives us in the face of suffering in a couple of weeks' time. But in the meantime, let us take the first step towards arriving by learning to humbly trust God. There's a prayer that you can pray underneath this video in order to help you to begin that journey. A journey of trusting that God is infinitely powerful, infinitely wise. And even though a lot about suffering and why God allows it won't make sense to us, we can still trust and depend on God.